and welcome to another episode of Talk'n TRM, the podcast dedicated to travel risk management. My name is Bex Deadman, also known as Travel Risk Bex. And today, my guest is, I'm going to describe him as a new friend, because even though he's been on my periphery, I was just saying to him, he's been on my list since when we first started these podcasts. And it's taken me this long to actually be able to kind of have a meeting with him and be able to tell him to ask him to be a guest. But on the other hand of it, he's been a massive fan and has been really supportive. And I think every single episode you've not listened to, you've certainly commented on. And I'm really, really grateful for all of that support. So without further ado, if I could ask you, who are you and what do you do?
Oh, absolutely, Bex. And it's an honor to have the opportunity as well, too. I just want to say. I'm Patrick Kane. I work in a role in corporate security, and my primary focus is travel risk, either indirectly or directly. It kind of touches almost every area of my position that I'm in. I've been with my current organization right now for over 20 years. Prior, I was a Marine Corps infantry officer, and then I worked as a manager for a security company in New York City for a couple of years before I started my current role. In the position I'm in, I'm responsible for a workforce that travels throughout the entire world, oftentimes on short notice. Oftentimes, I find myself having to respond to inquiries or requirements on very short notice. So it's a very fluid environment, very dynamic, but also very interesting and exciting as well, too. And in the course of that role, I've been able to do a lot of my own travel as well, to do assessments, evaluations, interact with providers, assess hotels, and so forth. And that's essentially had me in over 70 countries, I think, on the ground, being able to examine our operations. So it's been extremely interesting. I come from being on the security side. I come more from the perspective of security in terms of travel risk. And I think with the introduction of ISO 31030 and maybe a bit of a broadening of the TRM environment, I've become cognizant of the fact that there are other people who approach it from other angles. So for me, historically, it's been more about security, concerns about crime and terrorism, civil unrest, and things of that nature, with also a healthy concern about things involving medical as well, too, because we see the highest percentage of incidents ordinarily involve medical. But increasingly, as I've interacted with colleagues in other organizations, I found that there are people who are focusing on things that for me were not as high a concern. So it's been interesting. Historically, I've been involved with the State Department's Overseas Security Advisory Council here in the United States, which is a public-private partnership for organizations which operate internationally. And it's been a great opportunity to benchmark and to interact with colleagues in other organizations, other types of organizations. When you're in the same company as I've been for over 20 years, it's very helpful to have that interaction externally, because you see how other people manage things. You see the challenges that they have and they experience and they face. And OSAC for me has been extremely valuable as a channel for that. Recently as well, too, I was involved with the startup of the ASIS International TRM working group, which is a kind of a new group within ASIS that focuses on TRM issues. And we've had, really outstanding takeoff and success. We've added a lot of members very quickly. We currently, as of the time of our conversation, we have about 380, 390 members, I think. And we've had 3 in-person events, which has been a great opportunity to interact with people who are working in TRM at separate organizations. And sometimes there are people who are not within the OSAC space. So it provides us the opportunity to interact with people that we wouldn't otherwise necessarily. So all of those things have been kind of important factors in the kind of place I am now, I guess, within the TRM landscape.
Thank you so much. Wow. I mean, what an overview. Anyone listening knows exactly why this gentleman had to be on this podcast. Thank you so much. So there's a couple of things I just want to kind of go back on there. First, well, I'll say them both and then you can do them in whatever order you like. Firstly, I really kind of want to understand when you said TRM touches nearly every part of your working life, obviously from a security perspective, I'd really like to dig into that a little bit more and understand, what you mean by that. And then secondly, I think I really appreciated your honesty. We had such a good chat, didn't we, a few weeks ago, around this kind of broader perspective of travel risk
Hmm.
management. And I think there's so many practitioners that can actually offer so much in this space when we expand this to think about well-being, to think about mental health, to think about all of these, to think about climate and sustainability and all of these other kind of risks that are perhaps outside of security and on the ground situations, but are also posing huge risks to the businesses themselves. Sustainability being a huge piece, as we discussed, because it should be, the top three risk of any company now, their travel program, just generally, not alone what's happening with their staff, but actually what are they doing about reduction and emissions and things like that. So what I love about it is there's lots of um, there's lots of things to bring to the table, and I always sort of describe it as an umbrella that kind of operationally can bring some stuff together, which otherwise just exists in policy, and it doesn't really mean anything. So, right. So to get that across, I'm grateful for your honesty, but I'm interested to understand a little bit more around that and how that kind of then widens your perspective. So going back first, how does TRM, you said, affect you every day? How? Give us a
Well,
bit
I
more
think
information,
Yeah, I
please.
think when you look at the different things I'm involved with, I mean, I'm involved with intelligence, with protective operations, and other aspects of that nature. And a lot of times that's focused on global operations and global risk, and often the impact it's going to have on travelers. Because I'm with an organization that doesn't have a big infrastructural footprint, a lot of our exposure are people traveling. So things that maybe if I were to flash back 15 years, I might not think of it immediately as being TRM associated, like intelligence on a particular country that we're looking at having operations in, or setting up protective operations to go uh, provide a cover for somebody in a location who's got meetings, or somebody who's traveling for some other purpose. I might not have initially tied that to as much of a TRM uh, area as I do now, but now it seems that increasingly all these separate things they're kind of sub areas of specialization. I think within a broader umbrella, but they all do kind of fall under TRM because in almost every case there's a travel aspect involved.
And when there are situations and incidences, but sort of on the more major side, you can almost guarantee that the infrastructure and the travel infrastructure is going to be affected in some way, can't you? So it sort of becomes a a reality. The travel itself can affect travelers because of all the issues and things around that. But actually, when there's a big incident, travel has a massive part to play because often it's that it could be that the railway stations are closed down, it could be that the airports are shut, and suddenly you're in a whole different situation. So it's yeah, I really do value your the change that I think that you've had yourself, because I think it is when you have sort of been on the ground in the countries that you've been in, and I'm sure experienced some of the things that you have, of course you're going to see it from that side, and it makes so much sense. But I think one of the challenges then for organizations is they don't necessarily put the budgets across to it as they should do, and they kind of think, well, it's a 0.01% chance of happening, so we'll just kind of crack on and we'll be fine. But once you actually widen that to the travelers and their experiences and the knock-on effects of their health and all this other stuff, it suddenly brings other stuff into play, which is what excites me and kind of keeps me motivated and interested in it.
Well, I think you hit on something important also. When you talk about things like, for example, travel interruptions, which a lot of times I guess I would consider to be on the lower end of the impactful side of TRM. But there can be second order effects of those interruptions. So if you have a traveler someplace and the airport shuts down because of a volcano in that country, you may have the individual is in a position now where they're isolated in that particular country, and you may have to provide them help and support indirectly. Or if you have a situation where you have an event like a coup, for example, or civil unrest that impacts some of the transportation options in an area where you have travelers, even if the travelers are not immediately at risk because of those events, they are impeded from their travel. And depending about on how those events unfold, it may ultimately be something that's a concern for you as well, too.
No, completely agree. Completely agree. No, thank you. So, okay, let's get into your why. Where did all this come about? Why, and what is it that kind of continues to drive you forward? What's your story, Patrick?
Well, it's interesting, Bex, 'cause I thought about this before the call when we talked about some of the questions earlier and things like that. I think I really have to head back through the haze of history, really, to when I was a teenager. I grew up in a fairly modest family. I didn't have a lot of travel as a kid, but when I was in high school, I think it was a junior in high school at the time, we had a school trip over to Mexico. We were in Mexico City, and then we were on the Pacific Coast as well too. And when we were on the Pacific Coast, we two of our chaperones were snatched in a fake taxi cab. Um, so that was quite an eye-opening experience for me. I mean, I don't think I was a sheltered kid, but that was certainly an eye opener, even at that. And I think
Yeah.
kind of being involved in that incident and seeing it unfold over 3 or 4 hours, whatever period of time it was, and it ended without any serious issues. They were unharmed, were able to escape unharmed, and so forth. But it was I think an eye opening experience and something that perhaps primed me somewhat for things in the future. And then, of course, I had travel in the military, and as I got into the private sector, I had a interest in being involved more in the international issues. So I think that was kind of my start for it. But I think beyond that, being a traveler myself, and oftentimes a solo traveler, I have kind of an understanding of the issues that travelers can face, the concerns that can happen, and so forth. And I think a lot of times, if you don't have that experience, you see things unfolding in a very kind of textbook way. You think things are going to work out exactly as you plan. But particularly for travel in more austere places in the world, it really hardly ever works out as you plan. And being able to understand the perspective of the traveler, have some empathy with them, I think has been one of the things for me that's been a driving force. And I think being able to, at least up to the extent that I can, to educate travelers about some of these concerns and educate them about things that they may not think about, without those conversations, or without having that exposure to that material or that subject matter, is important as well too. Because I think a lot of times people take a very optimistic approach on travel, and they want to go out and meet new people and things like that, even if it's not a personal trip, it's a work trip and so forth, where they put complete trust in their partners in that country locally. And a lot of times that's not the ideal approach. And I think striking a balance between having people be cognizant of those concerns, while at the same time making sure you don't make them paranoid or make them unnecessarily concerned about something that isn't that high risk, I think is an important part. So I think all those things have been things that have kind of um, stimulated me in this field in TRM, and had me really interested in it and interested in expanding and growing in it. And to be honest, I'm still, as we talked about, I'm still expanding. I'm still expanding my perspective on it. I'm still really interested in taking in the perspectives of other people who are involved in this, and what their experiences are.
Wow. I mean, thank you for going back into the archives of a younger Patrick. I appreciate that. But wow, I mean, yes, I mean, that was it, wasn't it? I think without a shadow of a doubt, that's what kind of kickstarted the interest, and what an experience. Um, Grateful, obviously, that it all panned out, but I would imagine over those sort of 4 to 5 hours, that was pretty hell raising. And just to kind of give our listeners a little bit more on that, if you don't mind. So you witnessed it. Were you in a car with them, or were you in a car behind,
What
or?
happened basically was we were staying in one town, and we were heading to a town that was about 20 minutes away or so. And we were, most of the taxis, at least at this time, this was in the 1980s, were Volkswagen Bugs. So they could only accommodate a couple of people. I'd say probably three max, and the driver. So we had to be in several separate taxis. And we all got into different taxis, and our taxis went in one direction, and the chaperones went up going a separate direction. Um, And then over time, we kind of figured out they didn't show up where they were supposed to. As we tried to engage the authorities, we found out that the police, some places overseas, are not going to be as responsive or particularly care sometimes. And so it was kind of eye-opening experience in terms of not being able to get the help and support and being basically, 15, 16, 17 years old and trying to go, how do we handle this, manage this, and sort through it. So yeah, it was an experience for sure.
Yeah, unbelievable. Wow. And it just kind of makes me, I mean, obviously this was the 80s and I'm not gonna, it was what it was, but it just makes me kind of almost shudder, the fact that we've only just now kind of created ISO 31031, which is around youth travel, right? All of those years later. And don't get me wrong, there have been other things in place before. There was a BSI standard, but to actually really kind of elevate this to kind of the things we should be thinking about, it sort of just makes me shudder, because yeah, what a situation to be in. And that could have been just so horribly different. Um, and equally, I guess it's what I'm always interested when we have these stories is the learnings from them, because it's exactly these, we can't plan for everything. I guess we're in a position now in the world that enough stuff has happened that it doesn't really take much imagination to be able to kind of put plans around stuff. But those first time things happen, then you then learn from it. And I guess it's ensuring that whole sort of piece with the vehicles. Um, what can you do when you've only got sort of two-seater vehicles? How are you going to sort of manage that differently? But perhaps it would have been, getting a coach or something like that. You would never have kind of split into cars and done that sort of journey
Well,
like
yeah,
that.
I think a lot of it's about understanding what the issues are in that environment, which was the issue back. It was an issue in the 1980s. I mean, it's more of an issue now, probably, but it was an issue in the 1980s. And of course, this was all pre cell phones and things of that nature as well, too. So
Yeah, and I think this is one of the difficulties. And I think for a lot of us in this space, I say this a lot, we remember obviously the world pre-cell phones. When I first went traveling, the internet was just barely a thing, so kind of communicating with my family was quite arduous. And obviously them reading stuff in the papers and then having some crazy thing that's happened in their head to me because I've not been in touch, there's kind of there's that whole kind of emotional side to it as well. So I think it's one of the reasons we're kind of driven and passionate, because even though it's a lot easier to communicate these days, there's also a lack of kind of knowledge about stuff as well. I think we almost owe it to the younger generations coming up, that we can teach them how to do this better. Yes, communicate, you've got the tools to be able to do it, but there's this whole kind of learning. The world isn't quite like we think it is. And even just because it says it should be like this on Google or whatever app we're looking at, the reality is when you're in a situation, things could be wildly different, and your phone isn't going to help you maybe as much as you would hope it would in that situation. And that's one of the things that drives me, is that they don't know what they don't know. They were born into this world of technology, but the world isn't as it seems, and it's not potentially as safe as it seems. Then on the other hand, it's not necessarily as frightening as it seems either. We can use security in a really positive way for businesses and for developing markets to get people out there and to get change. So, but it's about, as you said, being aware of the situation and using that knowledge then to make informed decisions, right? As opposed to just, and I love the fact that you sort of said we always sort of take this positive element to trips, to business trips. We do, especially business trips, because we've got, there's a personal desire to go. There always is. It's driven by, you wouldn't be suggesting to your boss that you go and do a trip if there wasn't a personal desire to do it on one side. But then there's the kind of commercial reasons. You're out there to do a job, to do your job, to win business, to do whatever it is. So you're looking at all the positives, and you're often on a real tight schedule. So when stuff does go wrong, when there's delays, when there's red eyes to be caught, when there's all this stuff, that's going to have an absolute toll on you as well, and that's just never factored in. And it needs to be, right. There's some crazy statistics out there around the effect that airline travel has on the human body, and there's 6 different areas that it can affect, be that your stomach, be that your tiredness, and various other things. But it takes 24 hours for the body to get over every time zone. So do you just think about that back to back to New York for a second and what you've just done to your body in that time?
Yeah,
It's
I prefer
crazy.
to kind of not think about that actually because I take a lot of 8, 10, 12, 14-hour flights sometimes. So yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Patrick. Sorry. Get some vitamins in there, just so you'll be fine. There's ways around it. But yeah, there's a lot to think about, isn't there? So I just wanted to. I mean, you've kind of started with we've talked about lots of different bits and pieces in there, but I just kind of want to get to your golden nuggets, I guess, and then I'm going to kind of tie it back into some of the associations and stuff that you do because you just do so much. So anyone, I guess, getting into this space, and I think just because of the fact that you've learned and you're exploring that this is a lot bigger than you thought it perhaps was initially, perhaps, how do people get into this? Because it does feel a bit overwhelming, I think, sometimes.
Well, I think for me, and you could probably already intuit this from our conversation, but I think I work very much in the functional area of TRM, what I would call like the kind of more functional piece of it. And when ISO 31030 came out, which I think is actually an extremely helpful document, generally I'm not a big advocate of standards and things of that nature, which are created by a group of people that may or may not be appropriate for every organization. But I think ISO 31030 has a lot of good caveats in it about the culture of the organization and the capabilities of the organization that I think is extremely valuable. But I think if you examine all the different elements that exist within the ISO 31030, I'm very much in that functional space. So I really look at kind of three areas or three pillars of that functional TRM, which is the intel piece, understanding the area where travelers are going, what the issues are, the concerns and the risks, the countermeasures you take to make sure the exposure is as small as possible within that particular travel, and then the contingency planning and the response. So being able to respond if the other things fail, if you're understanding the environment and your other countermeasures fail, being able to have plans in place that you can activate in order to respond. So the intel piece, I think, starting first, I think it's important to understand the environment. And this is for both the individual traveler to understand it themselves and for the organization, if they're sending people there, to understand what the issues are and understand that whenever you are examining something like that, you really have to look at multiple sources. I speak to people who use like sole source and they accept it at face value. I think you need to have multiple sources. I think you need to account for biases. I think you need to apply critical thinking. And then I think you have to look at context. I think you have to look at the context of your travel or your traveler's travel in perspective with all the information that you have, because you can have an area where it's high risk with all the information that you get, but the reality is the travel itself, you may have a traveler who's going to be at the a hotel by the airport and they have one meeting that's a block away, go back to the airport and fly out, and their exposure is actually small. And you may have somebody who's traveling to an area that's I would consider to be a more medium risk, but they're going out into the local environment and society because perhaps it's an international aid group or something like that, and their exposure will be quite different. So understanding the context, I think, is important, and then applying the proper countermeasures, everything from hotels, evaluating the hotels you travelers are staying at, is that appropriate for that environment? And that could be a whole nother podcast as far as the aspects you want to examine for that. The same thing on ground transportation. I mean, we know historically that the majority of these issues occur when people are in transit. So even traffic accidents, the concern about traffic accidents, which is one of the highest incidents in terms of probability for having an issue when you're traveling, to things that are more intentional, carjackings and things of that nature. So understanding all those aspects, what you put in place, and then the traveler themselves, the individual steps that they should be taking to make sure that they're as safe as possible. Everything from checking into the hotel and finding the easiest fire exit, before you unpack and so forth. And then on the back end of that, um, even for all your planning, even for all the steps you take, things can go wrong. So understanding how will I handle this if things end up going wrong? If there's a situation in the country you have travelers in and something bad happens, is it safer to try to evacuate them quickly before the problem reaches them? Is it safer to have them shelter in place until things stabilize? And there's not going to be one correct answer. It's going to depend upon what's happening in that situation. But being able to at least kind of think through that, or even on a smaller scale, a traveler gets sick. Are you familiar with the hospitals in the area and the clinics? What's their capabilities? Do you have a provider who can help you with that? What's going to happen when they go to the hospital and they have to offer payment on the spot before they get treatment? Do you have somebody who can help you with that in terms of facilitation? So all those aspects, and sometimes I see organizations that have a more of a tick box approach, where they get the ISO 31030, let's say, or some other outline that, okay, yes, we have this, we have this, we have this, without really looking about, is it going to work? Is it going to work under stress? Do you have the ability to adapt when things aren't working exactly as they should? And then we talked a little bit about technology too, which is also, that could be a whole nother podcast. But with technology, just because we have it, we need to look at it as an aid, as a force multiplier, but not as a solution for everything. And a lot of times when you look at apps on phones and things of that nature, what's going to happen when the internet service is down, cell service is down, either because of a disaster or because of something happening internally inside that country where it ends up shut off intentionally. So all these separate things. I mean, I heaped a lot in there, I think, in my monologue, but I think it comes down to kind of three pillars of kind of being able to kind of functionally operate your TRM program, and kind of knowing that things are not going to appear as smooth in reality as on paper.
Thank you. There's, again, I'm like, which bits do I go back to? So I think this idea of the just as you were talking, I just came to a story came into my mind of a travel manager here in the UK who sort of first said to me, I just didn't even think about travel risk. I've traveled everywhere. I'm always in main cities. I'm always in a 5-star hotel. I just didn't even consider it. And then she was on a trip and she became really, really ill. So ill she couldn't get out of bed. She couldn't do anything. She thought she was going to die. Like, she was so unwell. But nobody did anything. Like, she was literally like on her own. The hotel didn't come and check on her. Her company just kind of let her crack on because she is so sort of organized. They just knew she'd sort of be all right. There was just no sort of check-in procedure at all. And she sort of had these moments in the sort of darkest days. And I think this was like 3 or 4 days it went on for, that she was kind of, she didn't leave the room. And I think, well, she was ill. And then I think even longer than that, she was just like, there is just no backup here at all. And it was that then just drove her, because, and this is something I talk to clients about a lot, this is when we get to this is people risk management, and a little nod to Bruce and what he talks about. Your policies have got to be adaptable, and your processes have got to be adaptable, not only to the destination, but as you rightly said, the activity and what is actually happening. What is that business trip about? And I think we do a lot of security stuff around high risk countries, but we don't think perhaps about the new employee, the post grad that's LGBTQI and then nips off to Dubai for the first business trip. We don't think about that stuff. And I do talk about this a lot. Or we go on these amazing trips with our business, with our companies, and they ply us with booze, and then they don't think about what happens from then on in. There's some stuff that I don't want to come across as the fun killers. That's not what this is about. But if we're putting ourselves in situations, we just need to think about all the different eventualities. And I think often the solutions are the same. So having your insurance in place, and having your security team in place, and having some sort of GSOC or whatever, whether you're outsourcing or whether you're doing that, and having your technology, that's all part of it, isn't it? But you're so right. We just do this tick box exercise, and actually the technology isn't ever really sold in to say exactly what it does. And there's so many different parts that everyone just kind of assumes that someone else has all this. And often it's just not fit for purpose. And I spend a lot of time, because you're talking my language when you talk travel technology, I know how it doesn't fit together. I literally know, because I was a TMC. So I know the plasters and the sticky tape and the goodness knows what else they're doing, and the manual work to make things actually look like it's all fitting together. And the reality is that this tick box is just not fit for purpose. And I go into corporate again and again, and they're like, yeah, we've got insurance, we've got TMC, we've got RMC. And I'm like, but what's actually happening to the data? What's really going on, and what can they see? And it's a real kind of lift the lid off panic moment. But then you can start, once you know what you're dealing with, you can build the framework around it. And but this kind of we've got it already. And I think that's what I try and spend a lot of time working with corporates, is to try and sort of build around that, understanding that yes, these things are there, but the technology and the solutions are not what we're actually focusing on in TRM. What we're focusing on in TRM is who you are, what you do, and how that affects everything, to then build the framework around it. But we're always looking for the easy way, aren't we? So then I think, yes, just to finally, just a little nod to the standard on that as well. I agree. And I wasn't a massive, I shouldn't say this because, I do a lot of work with ISO, but my experience of standards in the corporations that I'd worked for were always extremely negative, i.e., the business were not pro standards and saw them as a problematic thing to get, rather than actually the kind of what the reality they are is the kind of that it's your business. It's just write it down and tell people what you're doing, and then build frameworks around it. The reality is that business doesn't develop like that, though, does it? You grow really quickly and all this other stuff happens, and you're focused on growth and sales, and you don't think about the structure that sits behind it. And I had a bit of an awakening, and you're kind of nod to, I get it, who's writing these standards and how does this work? And I think that was one of the positive things about 31030. It was definitely sort of written by industry experts, hopefully in a language that people can understand and adapt to. But what it has done, and I'd like to hear your opinion on this, is it's opened up a bit of a can of worms across the travel industry, because funnily enough, we weren't that regulated. We were in air and we were in rail, obviously, for different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But accommodation and ground transport, those two things that you just touched on, arguably when your traveller is at their most vulnerable, um, no regulation. So it's opening up actually what I see as opportunity for standards, to sort of a family of standards to come to look after the industry. And do you think that that's something that, from your side, from the security side, that would be helpful? Because my experience is that you guys are doing a really good job dealing with an industry, which is the travel side, who are a little bit like, meh, we don't really know all this stuff. So would that make a difference if we had things like, I don't know, something we're working on at the moment, like a basic level of just security across accommodation that we just all agreed on globally, that as a minimum this is what people should have? Is that something that you would support?
I think it's helpful as a framework or a guideline. I really think that's the power in ISO 31030. Is I think it's not a certifiable type of a standard, so it provides a lot of flexibility, because I think it's hard to come up with blanket things that apply everywhere. And I think
Agreed.
even if you use experts or people are very specialized in a certain area, you get whatever it is, 8, 10, 12, 15 of them in a room. They still only are the sum total of their experience. And there are other people outside that group whose experiences are totally different. So I think we have to be kind of cautious about mandating anything. I think an educated consumer is the kind of best customer, if I could steal that tagline from whoever used to have it in their advertisement. But I think being able to be educated, if you're a manager responsible for TRM, to understand the things you need to look for, I think that's the important part. Because accommodations, again, depending on the threat, you may have a hotel, for example, that ticks all the boxes in terms of they have card access on the elevator and they have this and that, but maybe it's alongside an embassy that's a high value target in an area where there's concerns about terrorism. Or maybe it hosts a lot of high end VIP events and things like that that could be targeted. And there are places where an accommodation, which may not be as high a standard on paper, is sometimes safer for travelers because it's not as obvious of a target. Although it may have other vulnerabilities because of the lack of some of those things that we expect at the higher end properties. So I think being able to kind of balance that's important. And I think we have to be very cautious about saying having X, Y, and Z is always good, and not having A, B, and C is always bad. Because I think we need to have the space to be able to understand the kind of nuances in the environment and apply it. So I think I'm in favor of anything that provides us extra frameworks. And I think we still haven't seen the other side of 31030. What's going to happen when there's, say, for example, an incident occurs and it ends up in court, there's a lawsuit. Were you applying these things or not, and so forth? I think that's going to open up a whole nother issue there. But I think having frameworks is good, and I think it's very helpful particularly for people who are entering this field, because as quite a few of us have spoken about, there's not really a lot of good foundational training for people coming into the TRM field. So you kind of come in with your background that you have. So if you're coming from the travel background, it's going to be one thing. If you're coming from a protective services type background, it's going to be something different. So I think having a framework that we can all kind of use to see, okay, here are things we should consider applying and see how we apply them in our organization is good. I think once you get into kind of mandating things or saying you must do this, I think it becomes a problematic then. But one thing you hit on also too that I think is important for us to consider are traveler profiles. And traveler profiles are something that goes, I think, beyond a few of the more obvious things, even to other areas like age and any kind of medical history and so forth. So I mean, there's a whole lot to unpack with all of that, I think.
I think we need podcasts 3, 4, and 5. We're going to have one on profiles, one on accommodation, because we definitely have more to unpack there. Yeah, no, I agree. I do agree with you. And the debate's out, isn't there? There's been a lot of talk around certification for 31030 and what that could look like. And around what the travel service providers. The issue, I think, is that with such a wide variety of providers across the entire travel landscape, it's about, I think we as a basic minimum, we need the companies themselves and the suppliers to understand what they do and where their responsibilities lie. And if they can work that out between themselves, then we're in a much better place. Because at the moment, there's this nod and there's a lot of trust. Nothing's really evidence based. And it's, oh, they said they had this, they said they had this. And actually, there's, that means nothing when you're actually in court. And I think it is beginning to being used. I did have a conversation with a duty of care lawyer the other week, which was quite interesting. So obviously not finding out anything, but finding out that it's definitely coming, and it's definitely sort of being seen. But we'll see how that moves. They reckon that there's a 10-year journey with this sort of thing. So we're right at the very beginning. So it'll be interesting to see how it moves forward. Look, thank you so much for all of your experience, for giving me your time. That's the other thing, qualifications. We'll be picking up on that again soon too, as you well know. So you've been listening to another episode of Talk'n TRM, the podcast dedicated to travel risk management. My very, very special guest and long awaited and not disappointed in any way, just made it even better, Mr. Patrick Kane. My name is Bex Deadman, also known as Travel Risk Bex. Join us again for another episode in a couple of weeks. And in the meantime, please take care.